Good afternoon. My name is Cheryl Beck, and I'm a former board member with the Appalachian Women's Museum. And I'm happy today to share with you some information about quilts. Quilting to me is storytelling. And I grew up with a family of quilters, and their stories are transferred through some of the quilts that I have to share with you today. First of all, let me just say that quilting is an old art form, and in the Appalachian region, quilts were utilitarian first. But women took time out from their busy working schedule, working outside in gardens with livestock, and then all the home cooking and things that they had to do. But a highlight for many women was time spent with needle and thread and scraps of fabric to create beautiful works of art that would keep their family warm. A quilt consists of 3 layers, and often a pretty pattern was selected for the top of the quilt. For the insulating value, there is batting, and years ago it could have been an old quilt that was worn out that was used in between the layers. Just needed something thick to help keep folks warm. And then the back. And growing up, many of the quilts I grew up with had feed sack backing. When the family on the farm bought feed, they would come in sacks, muslin sacks, and I remember my grandmother saving those sacks, pulling the thread that was holding the sack together, and even using it in stitching. So let me tell you about some of the quilts I brought today and the stories that they tell. My 2 grandmothers, Grandma Aldridge and Grandma Carver, were quilters. One lived in town, one lived on the farm. And my grandmother Aldridge loved to make star quilts. So many of her quilts feature the star pattern. And each part of the star was a piece of the family's history. It could have been my Aunt Nellie's dress. It could have been a shirt that someone had. In one of my grandmother's quilts, there's a little piece of silk lining from my grandfather's hat that we discovered. But they didn't go out and buy fabric. They used what they had, and as you can see, this quilt was well worn and well used. The ends, the binding often came off because it was held up close to you when you were sleeping and rubbing against you, so many times that edge was worn out. This was a well-used star quilt that my grandmother Aldridge made. Now, she loved to work outdoors. She'd rather be outdoors than in, but I've often seen her with a quilting frame on her porch or a frame that let down from the ceiling in the wintertime working on quilts for her family. My grandmother Carver made most of my clothes when I was growing up, and when I was just a little girl, she made this colonial lady quilt for me that features a little appliqued antebellum or colonial lady with hand embroidery. And each one is different. And as you can see, this quilt has been well used too. Now, this quilt is an example of an applique pattern where a piece of fabric is cut into a shape and then just stitched by hand. The star that I showed you earlier is an example of a pieced pattern where the design is actually sewn together to form the square and pattern. My mother loved to quilt, and actually each of these women made quilts for their children and grandchildren. And my mother selected the bear paw quilt for me, and you can see this is a traditional, real old pattern called the bear paw. Each one of those looks like a bear's foot. Now she did go out and buy the fabric for this. My Aunt Nellie liked to quilt also, and she made an applique butterfly quilt. And again, colorful, but each one of these was from a dress or shirt that someone in the family had. And you could almost go through each of these and remember, oh yeah, that's the dress that I wore my first day of school or whatever. So it's really fun to pick apart the quilts. This is another example of an applique quilt that Leslie Pell made for my son when he was born. Many of the quilts feature children, like Overall Sam or Sunbonnet Sue. And again, those children's quilts are a little smaller and often more colorful in some ways. Now, all of these on the table were put together with hand stitching, and many of the stitches are small, but as the stitcher got older, sometimes those stitches grew larger because they couldn't see as well. My grandma Aldridge, for instance, her stitches got a little bit longer as she got older, and my Aunt Nellie, very uniform and tiny stitches. Another way to put together a quilt is called tacking, and this one almost looks modern, very almost 60-ish or so. It's really thick and warm, and instead of hand stitching around each segment of the quilt, there is tacking. Small stitches are taken all the way through to hold the quilt together, and on the back you will see tiny little places where the stitches hold the 3 layers together. It was a quicker, easier way to put a quilt together, and if you're just using it for utilitarian purposes, it worked fine. So when I went to Morris Hill College as a freshman, I packed a quilt because that's just what we used, and I'd always had a quilt on my bed. So I took my churn dash quilt. This is the churn dash pattern. It's in varying shades of pink and cream and white. And it was on my bed. I thought nothing of it, but I remember people coming by the room, the door would be open, and I heard some girls say, wow, she has a quilt on her bed. And to me, that was just the way I grew up. So quilts have an interesting, quilts are an interesting part of my family and many Appalachian families, and they tell stories, and they're something that we have passed on through the years. And I'm proud to say that I come from a family of quilters.